It was a typical morning at Oak Ridge High, a school where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. But that all changed when one student found himself in the middle of an unbelievable situation. It started with a minor classroom disagreement, a moment that should have been forgotten by lunchtime. But instead, it ended with a shocked student in the principal's office and a teacher with a story no one could believe. The teacher, who had always been seen as calm and collected, did something no one expected. In a burst of frustration, he used super glue to silence the students' defiance. The room went silent. Students gawked in disbelief. But what made the situation even more shocking was the fact that the student was the teacher's son, the principal's own child. The tension between father and son had always been a private matter, but now it was inescapably out in the open. Was this a sign of deeper issues within the family, or was something else at play? As whispers spread through the school, everyone wondered, how would the principal handle this? Would the teacher face consequences for his actions, or was he protected by his position in the family? The entire school was left in a state of shock, trying to make sense of the drama unfolding before their eyes. As the story spread like wildfire, one question echoed in everyone's mind. Could this incident bring about a change that no one saw coming, or would it all be swept under the rug? The answers might just shake the foundation of the school forever. The morning after the incident, Oak Ridge High buzzed with whispers. The hallway was alive with students gathering in groups, their hushed voices filled with shock and speculation. The story of the teacher using super glue on his own son had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Some students were in disbelief, others in awe, but no one seemed unaffected. It was the talk of the school, the one thing on everyone's mind, and no one knew quite how to process it. No one expected Mr. Turner, the normally composed, always approachable teacher, to snap. He had been a fixture in the school for years, known for his calm demeanor and his genuine care for his students. His son, Ethan, was a bit of a rebel, a student who often found himself at odds with the rules and authority. But despite their differences, everyone knew the Turners as a close-knit family. The principal, Mr. Turner Sr., was a figure of respect at Oak Ridge, a man whose reputation was almost untouchable. His steady leadership and the way he carried himself had always made the school feel safe and organized. But now, this shocking event had cast a shadow over everything. What had driven the teacher to go so far? What had happened in that classroom to push him to such an extreme? In the teacher's lounge, the air was thick with tension. Colleagues gathered in hushed groups, exchanging glances and talking in low tones. Everyone had their own theory, but no one dared to voice them aloud. Some wondered if Mr. Turner had been under more stress than anyone realized, perhaps personal issues, family pressures, or something even darker. Others speculated that it was an isolated incident, one that could be chalked up to an unfortunate lapse in judgment. But even they couldn't ignore the uncomfortable fact. The teacher's son was the one at the center of it all, and that added a layer of complexity that no one could easily understand. Principal Turner hadn't made any official statements yet. His office door remained closed, and no one had seen him since the morning the incident occurred. The staff had all been told to continue as usual, but the uneasy feeling in the air was impossible to shake. The school felt on edge, like it was teetering on the edge of something bigger. Was this just an isolated incident, or was there more to the story? Ethan sat alone in the principal's office, staring out the window with his arms crossed. He wasn't upset, though he certainly wasn't happy either. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. What had happened yesterday felt like a blur now. His father's reaction, the way Mr. Turner had snapped, and the way the whole room had gone silent when the glue was pulled out. It wasn't the first time his father had stepped in when things got out of hand, but it had never gone this far. Never. It wasn't the punishment that bothered Ethan, though. He had dealt with worse from his father before. The real issue was how everything had changed overnight. No one had ever questioned his father's authority before, not in the way they were now. The rumors were spreading like wildfire, and no one seemed to care who got hurt in the process. Even his friends were pulling away, unsure of how to act. Ethan could feel their eyes on him every time he walked through the halls, and it made him uneasy. The once unbreakable bond between him and his father now felt strained, fragile. Ethan had always been rebellious, but it had never been this personal. There had always been a distance between him and his father, but it was a distance born of love, even if unspoken. His father had always been strict, expecting the best from him, but there was a deep sense of pride in Ethan's heart for everything his father had done for him. But today, he wasn't so sure. The truth was, Ethan didn't understand what had happened in that classroom. He had been mouthing off, as he often did, but nothing had ever prompted such a reaction from his father. Sure, he'd seen his dad get angry before, but this was different. It wasn't just about the rules or respect. It felt personal, like something was building up under the surface that no one had talked about. At the same time, Ethan wasn't sure if he could even talk to his dad about it. They had never been the type of family to open up. There were unspoken rules, boundaries that kept their relationship cordial but distant. His father had always been the disciplinarian, and Ethan had always played the role of the rebellious son. But now, everything was up in the air. What did this mean for their future? Would they ever go back to being the family they once were? Outside the principal's office, the school's atmosphere was tense. Students exchanged knowing looks, and the teachers walked with a sense of unease. The unease wasn't just because of what had happened. It was because of the silence that followed. No one knew what would happen next. Everyone was waiting for something, anything, that could bring clarity to the situation. The mystery of it all made it worse. No one had answers, and that made it all the more unsettling. Across the hall from the principal's office, a teacher named Mrs. Patterson sat at her desk, flipping through some papers. Her thoughts, however, were not on the lesson plans in front of her. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had seen Mr. Turner struggle with Ethan in the past, but she had never expected anything like this. Mrs. Patterson had always admired Mr. Turner, respected him as both a colleague and a friend. But now, seeing the fallout from his actions, she couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. She had seen the tension between father and son before, but she never imagined it would escalate to this. She couldn't help but wonder if there had been more going on behind the scenes than anyone knew. Was there a deeper reason for Mr. Turner's outburst? Was it just a simple case of stress, or was something darker at play? The thought of it made her stomach churn. She had worked with Mr. Turner for years, and had always admired his calmness. He had a way of dealing with difficult situations that made him a respected figure at Oak Ridge. But this was different. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for far too long. As the day dragged on, the tension only increased. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for answers, but no one was willing to ask the questions that needed to be asked. The students, the teachers, the principal, they all seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Would this incident be the breaking point, the one thing that would change everything? Or would it be swept under the rug, a quiet and uncomfortable memory that no one would speak of again? The story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as the sun began to set on another long day, the questions lingered in the air, unanswered and unresolved. The days following the incident passed in a tense, surreal quiet. Oak Ridge High continued with its routines, but everything felt off. The air in the hallways was thick with whispers, and even the students who weren't involved in the drama seemed to carry a weight with them. The once familiar halls now felt like they were closing in on everyone, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. The teachers, too, were unsettled. Mrs. Patterson couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. No one had seen Mr. Turner, the teacher, since the incident. Rumors swirled that he was on leave, that he had been suspended, or that he was simply hiding out in shame. But no one knew for sure. Principal Turner remained a quiet, looming figure. He had refused to speak about the incident, leaving everyone to speculate. Ethan, meanwhile, had been absent from school for several days, only fueling the mystery and gossip. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson ran into another teacher in the parking lot after school. He looked just as shaken as she felt. "It's like the whole place is holding its breath," he said, his voice low. "You think things are going to settle down soon?" "I'm not sure. I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen next," she replied, glancing toward the school building. "But it feels like something big is coming." They exchanged a look, one full of understanding but lacking any real answers. Mrs. Patterson's thoughts drifted back to Mr. Turner and the way he had been in those final moments of the class before the incident. He hadn't been himself. His eyes had been different, colder. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple loss of temper. There was something simmering beneath the surface, a tension between father and son, perhaps, that had been building for years. Back at home, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the walls. The silence was oppressive. He hadn't been to school in days, not since the glue incident, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face everyone again. The phone calls from friends had stopped coming. They didn't know what to say to him, and Ethan didn't know what to say to them either. His thoughts kept circling back to his father. What had happened between them? What had caused everything to unravel so quickly? He had always known his father to be a man of principle, someone who stood firm in his beliefs. But now Ethan wasn't sure he even knew him anymore. He hadn't heard from his father since that day in the office. Had his father even tried to call him? Had he come to terms with what had happened? Ethan was stuck in a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, confusion, hurt. But above all, he was afraid. Afraid of what would happen next, of what his father would do, of how they could ever go back to what they once were. And then one evening, just as Ethan had begun to think he might be able to avoid facing everything head-on, he received a message. It was from his father. The message was brief, only a few words, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. "We need to talk." Ethan sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the screen. He had no idea what his father wanted to say, but he knew that whatever it was not going to be easy. He glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for normal conversation, but there was no way around it. Ethan had to face him. He had to confront the situation, no matter how painful. The next morning, he stood outside his father's office, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. He took a deep breath before knocking softly on the door. When he heard the faint reply from inside, he pushed the door open and stepped in. His father was sitting at his desk, his face unreadable, a storm of thoughts hidden behind his steady eyes. The silence between them felt like an eternity. Ethan opened his mouth to speak but found that no words came out. He wasn't sure where to begin, or even what to say. Finally, his father spoke. "Ethan." His voice was softer than usual, but there was a certain coldness to it. "I don't know what to say. What happened that day, what I did, was wrong, and I know that." He paused, his gaze never leaving his son. "But you need to understand, you're not the only one who's been struggling. I'm not just your father, I'm the principal of this school. I carry a lot on my shoulders, and I've been carrying it alone for too long." Ethan flinched at the words, but his father continued, each sentence like a small crack in the fragile barrier between them. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan, but there's a lot more happening than you know. There are pressures, expectations, things that have been weighing on me for years. And that day when I saw you disrespect Mr. Turner, it felt like everything I've been holding back just broke. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking about you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'm not going to make excuses for my actions. I was wrong." Ethan wanted to say something, wanted to speak his mind, but the words caught in his throat. His father's confession hit him harder than he had anticipated. For so long, Ethan had thought his father was the one who needed to be in control, the one who held all the answers. But now, seeing the vulnerability in his father's eyes, Ethan wasn't sure what to think anymore. The man who had always seemed unshakable now seemed lost, broken in a way that Ethan had never imagined. "Do you even care about me anymore?" Ethan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. His father didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at his son, his face full of regret and sorrow. Ethan wasn't sure if his father was trying to find the right words or if he simply didn't know what to say. But whatever the answer was, it was clear that something between them had shifted irreparably. The conversation, if it could even be called that, left Ethan feeling more uncertain than ever. Before he could leave the office, his father spoke again, more quietly this time. "Ethan, there's something you don't know. Something about why I reacted the way I did. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan froze. The words were barely out of his father's mouth when the door suddenly swung open. Mrs. Patterson stepped into the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with alarm. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to hear this." Her voice was shaky, and Ethan could tell something was very wrong. His father's face hardened in an instant. "What is it?" "It's about Mr. Turner," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's something you need to know about his past. It's not what you think. It never was." The room went still, the words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The mystery was far from over. It was only just beginning. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ethan glanced between his father and Mrs. Patterson, his heart racing. The tension in the room had escalated, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt completely out of his control. His father's usual composure was nowhere to be found, replaced by a flicker of something darker in his eyes. The expression on his face was one Ethan had never seen before, part fear, part anger, and entirely unrecognizable. Mrs. Patterson took a hesitant step forward, clearly nervous about what she was about to say. "I know this is hard to understand, but it's important," she continued, her voice strained. "Mr. Turner, he's been hiding something. Something from a long time ago. Something that involves your family." The room seemed to shrink around them, as Ethan felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. His father didn't move. Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted to Ethan, her expression a mix of urgency and sorrow. "I didn't want to say this, but this situation with your father, it's not just about him snapping at you. It goes deeper." Ethan's mind reeled, the confusion mounting. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What does this have to do with Mr. Turner? What could he possibly have to do with my dad?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated, looking back at his father as if searching for permission. But there was no response from him, only silence. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low but clear. "I was a teacher here when your father first became principal. Mr. Turner wasn't just a colleague back then. He was also a close friend of your father's. Or I should say, he was before everything changed. They had a falling out, a massive one. And it all centered around a secret your father has kept hidden." Ethan's pulse quickened as his father shifted in his seat, the calmness he had always carried now replaced by something else. "You don't need to listen to her, Ethan," his father muttered, his voice hoarse. But there was no stopping Mrs. Patterson now. "You need to know the truth," she said, ignoring his father's warning. "Mr. Turner wasn't always the person he appears to be. And neither was your father. The two of them were involved in something your father never wanted you to find out. A secret that Mr. Turner, when he was still a part of your family's life, almost took to the grave." Ethan's mind was reeling. His father had been hiding something. And what did it have to do with Mr. Turner? Was this all some kind of conspiracy? The confusion was overwhelming, but beneath it, a deep sense of dread began to form. "My father, what happened between them?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking, though he couldn't tell if it was from anger or fear. Mrs. Patterson looked at his father once more, but this time, it wasn't a glance for permission. It was one of sorrow. "You're going to have to ask him that," she said quietly, turning away. "But be warned, Ethan. You may not like what you find out." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The faint sound of her footsteps echoed down the hall, leaving an eerie silence in her wake. Ethan stood frozen, unsure of how to react. His father's hand gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. The tension between them was suffocating, more unbearable than anything Ethan had ever experienced. His father wasn't just hiding the truth, he was hiding something that had the power to unravel everything. The silence stretched between them, and Ethan knew that in this moment, his father had a choice. He could tell the truth and risk everything, or he could continue to hide behind his walls of control. The choice was his, but Ethan wasn't sure he could take much more of this. Finally, his father spoke, his voice a low murmur. "Ethan, I never wanted you to be a part of this. You're too young to understand. I've protected you from it your whole life. I never meant for it to spill over into your world, especially now. I should have kept it buried." Ethan's eyes burned with frustration. Buried? What is so bad that you had to hide it? What could possibly be so important? His father's face contorted with pain, but his voice remained calm, controlled. "You don't get it. There's so much more to everything than you know. This isn't just about me, and it's not about Mr. Turner. There's a history here, one that's far darker than you could ever imagine." Ethan's thoughts were racing, but one thing stood out above all else: his father's refusal to answer his questions. "What history?" Ethan demanded. "What is it? You can't just keep feeding me half-truths. I deserve to know what's going on, don't I?" His father stood up slowly, his eyes clouded with regret. "You don't need to know. It's too dangerous. Trust me. I've done everything I could to keep you safe, to keep this whole family safe. But it's too late now." Ethan could feel the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to believe that the man he had looked up to for his whole life was hiding something so monumental, so terrible. But deep down, he could feel the truth clawing at the edges of his mind. His father was a man of integrity, or at least that's what Ethan had always thought. Now, it seemed like everything was built on a foundation of lies. But the more Ethan thought about it, the more his mind began to piece things together. Mr. Turner hadn't been just an innocent bystander in all of this. He had known something so big that it had ruined his relationship with Ethan's father. The question was, why? Why now? Why had everything come to the surface? Before Ethan could ask another question, the door swung open again. Mrs. Patterson reappeared, this time accompanied by a stranger, a man in a dark suit, his face tense and full of purpose. Ethan's eyes widened as he recognized the man. It was the police chief from the nearby town, a stern man known for his no-nonsense approach. "This isn't over, Mr. Turner," the police chief said, his voice sharp. "We've been looking into this for a long time. And now we have questions that need answers. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." Ethan's father stiffened, his entire body locking in place. Ethan could see the panic in his father's eyes for the first time. Whatever was happening, it was much worse than he had ever imagined. And now, the truth was finally coming to light. But what did that mean for them? What did that mean for their family? The room was filled with a sense of impending chaos, a storm on the horizon, and Ethan had no idea how it was going to unfold. The pieces were all falling into place, but the answers were still so far out of reach. And as the tension built, he realized that the true scope of the secret his father had hidden was still just out of sight, waiting to crash into their lives with a force none of them could predict. The police chief's words hit the room like a thunderclap, shaking the air around them. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning as his father's face drained of color. The walls that had stood for so long between father and son seemed to crack, threatening to crumble entirely. Ethan could see his father's resolve cracking, like a dam on the verge of breaking. He was no longer the unflappable man he had once thought he knew. Mr. Turner, we've already got all the evidence we need, the police chief continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight of finality. This isn't something you can hide anymore. It's time to face the truth. Ethan turned his eyes toward the man who had once been a family friend, someone his father had trusted. Mr. Turner had always seemed like the dependable kind teacher, but now it was clear that nothing about him was what it appeared to be. The man stood at the edge of the doorway, his hands clasped tightly together, his face pale. "Don't do this, Chief," his father spoke at last, his voice cracking under the pressure. "You don't understand. There's so much more to this than you think." But the chief didn't waver. "There's no excuse for what you've done. And there's no way out of this anymore." Ethan's mind whirled with 100 different thoughts. He had been so sure that his father was a good man, that he could always rely on him to protect their family. But the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the more he realized how much had been hidden from him. His father, a man of authority in the community, had been concealing something dangerous for years. And now it was coming to light. As the silence in the room stretched, Ethan's mind went back to the moment when he had first suspected something was wrong. The look in his father's eyes before he had raised his hand to him, the tension that had been building over the weeks leading up to that disastrous day. It wasn't just stress or the pressure of being a principal. It was something deeper, something darker. "Please," his father begged, his voice filled with desperation. "Let me explain. This is not what you think." But it was too late for explanations. The damage had already been done. Ethan couldn't unsee what had been revealed. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face grim. "We tried to protect you from this, Ethan. We all did. But your father's actions, they're too dangerous to ignore any longer." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the full weight of what was happening settled over him. "What did he do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The room seemed to go cold as Mrs. Patterson turned toward the police chief, her expression full of regret. "You deserve to know the whole story, Ethan. Your father has been covering up a crime, something that happened many years ago." Ethan looked between his father and the police chief, a wave of disbelief washing over him. A crime? What kind of crime? The chief took a step forward. "It's a long story, but the short version is this. Many years ago, your father was involved in an accident, a tragic one. A young girl's life was lost, and it should have been reported. But your father, desperate to protect his career, his reputation, he kept it quiet. He covered it up, and he made sure no one would ever find out the truth. Not even you." Ethan staggered back, his mind racing. His father had been involved in something so awful, so unforgivable. All the pieces of his life, the things he had taken for granted, felt like they were crumbling away in an instant. He couldn't process it. The anger inside him rose, threatening to boil over, but at the same time, there was a deep sense of betrayal that took his breath away. "Is this true?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. He turned toward his father, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You kept this from me. You kept this from us." His father, trembling, looked like a man caught in a storm, unable to break free. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unable to find the words. Ethan's heart twisted in his chest. How could this be happening? How could the man who had always told him to do the right thing be the one hiding the truth? But before he could react further, the police chief stepped in. "Your father's actions led to the young girl's death, Ethan. And worse, he covered it up, making sure that no one would ever know the truth. But this wasn't just about him. Mr. Turner was also involved, though his role was different. Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Mr. Turner, the teacher he had admired, the man who had always been so kind to him, he, too, had been part of this dark secret. It didn't make sense. How could this happen? But then, the chief continued, his words shattering everything Ethan thought he knew. Mr. Turner tried to make it right. He came forward years ago with the truth, But your father threatened him, forced him into silence. And that's why your father and Mr. Turner stopped being friends. That's why their relationship fell apart. Mr. Turner was too afraid to speak out, but he never forgot. And now, after all these years, it's come back to haunt us all. Ethan's mind couldn't keep up with the revelations. His father had silenced Mr. Turner, threatening him into silence. This was more than a simple mistake. This was a deliberate cover-up that had cost someone their life, that had cost his family the truth.